There's no doubt current market conditions are challenging. We're driving the change to electrification against a backdrop of a fragile economy, cost of living pressures, and above all, uncertainty, both in the UK and abroad.
The prevailing sentiment is that of complexity. Customers are really keen to decarbonise, but those high vehicle costs, gaps in infrastructure, and most importantly, policy uncertainty is really slowing adoption.
The whole of our industry needs to collaborate more and work in partnership to build consumer confidence in electric vehicles. Instead of everyone fighting their own narrow agenda for small potential competitive advantage, getting the industry aligned on the facts about electric vehicles will help with growing the whole market.
We're seeing more and more electric vehicles come to the market, and the manufacturers are heavily discounting those and marketing them. And last year we had the largest BEV market in Europe, with growth expected this year of 20% and further 20% again next year. That should be a real success story. But with the ZEV mandate and that gap to those targets widening, it's a real concern.
Hey, welcome to our guests, all of them. I want to start with what Andrew Griffiths was saying, just in case anyone wants to go there and pick it up. So his challenge to everyone was, you have said in the past things to government that you thought they wanted to hear. You haven't been honest enough about the role of the customer, the role of actually getting people to want these vehicles in both the commercial and the personal sector, I guess. Does anyone, is he right, is he wrong?
Well, I suppose from the
Go for it.
So from the SMMT side, I think we tend to be very honest and transparent, evidence-based, and I think we've given very consistent messages throughout the period. It's going to be a very challenging transition. We've always said that, but increasingly we need to be working together to move it forward together, and everybody working in the together. We did a report earlier in the year in it together. It's all about moving things together from the manufacturing point of view, the charger point of view, but also from the government's point of view. And we've been very honest, I think, with government that they really need to step up. The ZEV mandate is their big measure to decarbonise.
Do you all agree with that? But basically, there has been honesty when it comes to the messaging from the industry to government.
Well, I think on behalf of Volvo and commercial vehicles, I think we were all very optimistic about the adoption. And I don't think this was particularly communicated to government, but I think definitely we felt we'd be further forward than we are today. And for various reasons we haven't got there. But I think there was an optimism that hasn't borne fruit.
Yeah.
I suppose from the consumer perspective, so as EVA England, we represent the EV driver. I actually think one of the reasons that we've not got there is because of the uncertainty created when Rishi Sunak weakened the target from what was 2030 to 2035. So consumers don't understand the ZEV mandate, but they do understand phasing out sales by 2030 and 2035. And I think that is when we saw the first impact on consumer confidence, because projected sales at that point were pretty good. So I do think we need to be a bit honest that I don't think some of the political rhetoric can help. And I think in a previous panel, certainty for the consumer is really important here.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that point. We saw exactly the same on Auto Trader, where consumer confidence was dented when people were told maybe don't do the thing that you'd previously been told you should be doing. People have memories of things like diesel. They were told by Gordon Brown to buy diesel and they were told it's a bad idea. So that lingers in, I think, the memory of car buyers. I think long-term certainty is important, and I think it's good to see that it feels like we are in that point now, but it feels like there needs to be more of an impetus behind the right words being used, but more substance. By substance, I don't mean realistically any of us think that the government has billions of pounds to throw at EV incentives to encourage people into EVs, but I think there are measures that can be signalled that are more positive. If we look at what happened when EV incentives were taken out in past times, we didn't see a decline on Auto Trader of people engaging in them, but only 40% of people knew that they even existed in the first place. But the trouble is people were buying expensive cars, and they didn't necessarily back then need them. They were buying maybe a Tesla for £50,000, so a £2,000 plug-in car grant wasn't really fundamentally impactful.
Yeah. Okay, so where are we? We should maybe start with commercial sector, and actually with Volvo. What's going right? What's going wrong?
Okay, so I'm using Hannah's notes, and she's used the word stalling, which I think is a nice automotive word. I'm not sure it's quite the right description. I think we've plateaued at
I thought you couldn't stall an electric vehicle.
Well, exactly, it's difficult. So I think we've plateaued at a low level. It's, as I said a minute ago, it's certainly not where we thought we would be. We expected it to take off far quicker than it has. What's gone wrong? What's gone right? I guess on the sort of negative side, our products are still very expensive. It's very difficult for our customers to get a good TCO. There are niches, there are sectors, there are use cases, but for the vast majority, it's very hard. Energy costs being part of that. We know, as we've just heard from Chris Giles, the economy is not really raging. It's not a great time to be investing in very, very heavy assets or very, very expensive assets. On the sort of more positive negative side, gas trucks do work. You know, there's lots more use cases for gas trucks, and maybe some of the people who would otherwise be buying zero emission are going that way. And of course, there's HVO, which is sort of a swap for diesel you can do. And we know at the sort of owner-driver end of the market, that's what they tend to do, because it's easy. It's really easy for them to do that and still show CO2 savings. But I guess gas and HVO don't work for the long term. We have these combustion bans coming in 2035, 2040. So we really need that zero emission sector to take off. And I guess we're going to hear in a few more minutes ways we can make that happen.
Yeah. Damien, tell us about the consumer sector.
Well, in the spirit of a little more positivity, perhaps, there are things to celebrate and things to look at as progress in terms of the move towards EV. So we have seen growth in EV. We've seen growth in demand for electric vehicles this year. So there is movement towards it. To the previous point in terms of nodding along and agreeing with government, the government had, to their credit, a consultation phase where we all had the opportunity to feedback. Some of the feedback that we've given is still with government in terms of incentives, charging network improvements overall that are needed to encourage more people to the market for electric vehicles. But in terms of the customer sentiment now, what they're waiting for, you mentioned expensive cars. Volkswagen Group also has some expensive cars in our portfolio. Ian mentioned it too, but now we're moving towards having more affordable. So the Elrock from Skoda, for example, was the #1 selling electric vehicle in Europe in April after its launch. So that's what a price point here in the UK of about £31,000. So you've got cars now that are becoming more affordable, but there's still a big gap in terms of retail buyers being able to access electric vehicles. We see the growth more in fleet than in retail, so we badly need stimulus for retail buyers to come and buy electric vehicles.
But so specifically, what is the stimulus that you need to see?
Well, if you look at Norway, for example, which is the leader in terms of the adoption of electric vehicles, Norway put incentives in place, much lower tax rates, exclusion entirely of VAT rates, for example. So whether our government is in a position to go that far with the current economic situation is questionable, but certainly offering incentives for customers to make the change and make the switch, because the alternative is what we're seeing right now is they're postponing changing a vehicle at all. So we've got an older fleet of cars on the roads instead of having a fresher fleet of electric vehicles. So if, for example, they put in incentives to change your older car to an electric vehicle, that would be a stimulus that would work. They also need to look at incentivizing charging infrastructure to have more points available and take away any opposition to charging those cars as well. So there are some points that we've left with government.
Ian?
I totally agree with those points. The affordability question is the fundamental blocker on the electric vehicle transition. There are points around charging anxiety and so on, more than range anxiety, we all know that. I think what we're seeing overall in the market is that the gap is coming down between ICE and EVs. There's a 22 percentage point gap the sort of wrong way at the moment, if you look at an average like-for-like comparison of an ICE to an EV. But there are plenty of cases where that's no longer such a gap. So there's a great example of that, the Elrock compared to the Karoq, where I think it's about the same price, same brand. You look at the Renault 5, the Hyundai, Insta, cars that are flying at the moment on our platform in the market. They're coming to the market in affordable segments for a start, as well as more comparably priced to their ICE equivalents. So they are seeing great success. It does feel like there's a second factor in the sort of market context, which is fundamental right now. It's not just regulation, but competition is driving things forward. There are players coming to the market, like that great example from Skoda, Renault, etc., as well as Victor's example of JQ, who are already up to the 9th position in the top 10 new car brands on Auto Trader. BYD are surging into 10th. They weren't there at all. So the competition factor is probably at least as big as the regulation factor in what's really shaping the market just now. There are 70 brands in the UK selling new cars for a 2 million or so market, sub 2 million. Before the pandemic, it was a 2.5 million market, usually roughly. But there were just 45 brands. So by the end of maybe 18 months' time, I'd expect we'd be at 80 brands. So by definition, either they're going to get more sort of tighter in pricing, grow the market potentially, unlock some of what Chris Giles just mentioned, where there is a correlation in the new car market. It's with macroeconomic indicators, it's with consumer spending and lower household savings ratio. The households have got money right now. To unlock that money, we need to find ways of making the cars more attractive, which is challenging for many manufacturers, but some are managing to do it, so it is possible.
When it comes to range, I mean, there are two things, aren't there? There's, number one is the business of whether you can access the ability to recharge en route. But number two, battery size and length and ability and all the rest of it. I mean, where are we on range, Vicky, at the moment, and range anxiety and this kind of thing that we talked about so much? I don't know, I feel it was 2 or 3 years ago we were talking about it more, but unquestionably it is still there, at least in the minds of consumers, and possibly more in the minds of the media than in reality. What should we be saying about it?
I think you're right. I think it's possibly, so it's definitely in the minds of those who don't have electric cars. So when we survey electric car drivers, range anxiety is not a thing. Like, you know, electric car drivers know that these cars are capable and they know how to charge them. If you're not an electric driver, I think, you know, the comments about cost and affordability, yes, they're still barriers, but fundamentally, people are stepping into a new technology, a technology they know nothing about. They're used to refueling at a petrol pump. They don't know how to use the chargers, they don't know how to plug in, they don't know how to pay for charging, they don't know how to get a charge point. And I think that sort of, so I think tackling some of those issues and that education is actually also really, really important to selling. And it's got to be at the point of sale where people are thinking about these cars, as well as work that some of us and other organisations are doing just to try to attract people into them. And it is one of the number one barriers as well. As you say, the media go on about, they always find the worst story, but actually if you talk to 91+% of EV drivers never look back and never have a problem. And I think it's, you know, getting that information out there, getting people to understand this sector works and it can work for them and how it can work for them is actually fundamentally what one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest things we all need to do.
Well, Damien, how do you address that challenge?
That's an interesting point, because we mentioned earlier the affordability, and the cars that are more expensive are generally purchased by customers who have the means to charge, who have home charging available, and avoid that whole challenge of trying to find public charging. But when I speak to people about why they don't take an electric vehicle or what they feel are the barriers to it, they are living in terraced housings or apartments. They're living in places where they can't get regular charging. So that takes away the big, strong argument of charge at home for far less than you would put gasoline or diesel into a car. So what do you do about that is you try and incentivize more and more uptake of high-powered charging, local charging. Government needs to get involved, of course, by having localized charging. So lamppost and terraced avenues, for example, which can be used on slow charges overnight for those that are parking on roadside. But the charging industry, and I'm not going to put pressure on the charging industry to overinvest because they're also commercial entities and need to have a return for their shareholders. But another example of government getting involved is to grant tax-free thresholds or interest-free loans for charging entities to come and oversupply the market in the short term. When we raised this with Heidi Alexander and with Johnny Reynolds when we spoke to them some months ago, is that if they do that, then you remove that chicken and egg. I won't buy an electric car because there's not enough charging. We won't install enough chargers because there's not enough electric cars. So something's got to give to free up that whole process. And again, that's a government role to step in and incentivize.
The oversupply thing is really interesting, isn't it? Because that's, I mean, just as a consumer, that's what you want to see, is loads of free charging spaces and kind of, I want to get into that because it looks really easy.
It takes away a doubt, and that's the most important thing. And as Vicky already mentioned, the customers that are driving electric vehicles don't look back and they don't have those problems. They've gotten over an anxiety or a perceived anxiety, but we need to do more for the next cohort of buyers to move into that space, start buying more affordable electric cars, but also having charging available in their area to remove the barrier to purchase.
But from the SMMT's perspective, how clued in is the government to that sort of issue? There need to be kind of clever ways of pushing that might not be that costly, but need to be thought through.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are aware, and obviously the industry is very much making them aware. They can see from the data, you know, that the market is moving, but it's not moving at quite the pace that the ZEV mandate should be at, and the private market in particular hasn't moved at that pace. You know, it's still at the levels it was when they removed the plug-in car grant back in 2022, the private market. But, you know, they definitely understand, but whether or not they can afford to do the things, I think is the challenge. And then we've also seen, unfortunately, some other aspects of taxation which has moved against the electric car market. So, you know, Mike mentioned earlier, vehicle excise duty and the expensive car supplement. We've also seen other measures that government is proposing or has proposed to do, which is impacting on the costs of doing business in the UK from a taxation point of view, things like e-cost cars or double cab pickups, which are slowing the overall market and therefore sort of not enabling the manufacturers to support the EV markets, because often there's an idea of cross-subsidisation. But they have listened with the ZEV mandate. They've been a bit more flexible there, but they've still not really addressed that big issue of where demand needs to be and that nudge mechanism that we really need at this point in time.
Yeah. And in the commercial sector, from Volvo's perspective, again, listen to, not listen to, what's the kind of sense of?
No, I definitely think the government has been in listening mode for a little while now. Definitely lots of good interactions, good listening. We're not really seeing the output yet. I mean, we're not seeing that silver bullet that's really going to change something. There's lots of discussions. There are lots of things we're putting forward. We're trying to be sensible. It's easy to just ask for subsidy, but we appreciate that doesn't really work for anyone. So there's lots of discussion, but we're just not seeing anything coming out yet that's really moving the dial.
When you look at the statistics, you see that fleet business drives the uptake in battery electric vehicles. So all of the increases in battery electric vehicles is fleet. And there's a point at which you'll saturate the fleet market, and every fleet driver who's incentivized through their salary sacrifice or other incentives, they will all take an uptake, and then we'll reach a level of plateauing on battery electric vehicle adaptation unless they stimulate the retail market. So the retail buyer is not coming to our showrooms for a battery electric car, unfortunately.
Yeah. Ian?
Not yet. I agree with the point. It's totally at the moment dominated by fleet. And it's a good thing that the government has maintained the support in that direction in the recent consultation, because we need it, because we need the industry to be able to scale. If you look at the Chinese market, they've scaled already, they've got more affordable product over there, it's a different kettle of fish. We need over here to generate the same sort of economies of scale that they're able to already see. So keeping the volume coming through the fleet channel at the moment is an absolute must. Hopefully that will create, with the competitive sort of pressures that I talked about before, the new generations of electric vehicles that are already coming to the market. I mentioned a couple of examples. There are many on the way. Hopefully in the next couple of years we will see burgeoning choice already beyond what we've got today and more affordability. If you look at just the choice factor, there are around 150 electric models available to buy today in the new car market. There are around 210 ICE models available to buy. That number's coming down slightly. The EV number's shooting upwards. That number used to be paltry in comparison. Within that, there are about 35 that are under £30,000. There used to be just a handful. So there are now affordable cars and a whole choice of cars across the range. Add in plug-in hybrid and range extenders, you're about another 100 more than the total sum of ICE vehicles. So there's more choice. And as those cars get better and the economies of scale come through and the new technologies come into play, the battery costs are coming down, the new batteries are able to be included into the cars, developed much quicker now by many Western brands, not just Chinese brands. I'm relatively confident that the retail consumer will then, in a couple of years' time, see that available vehicle more affordable in all the choice buckets that they could wish for, and be able to step up, because we do need it. I totally agree with Damien on that point.
What are the choice buckets? Because that's interesting, isn't it? So looking at it from the perspective of the consumer, including those consumers who haven't yet, who don't have electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, and you want to bring them in, do we have a kind of sense of what it is? Is it range, which is a misunderstanding? Is it battery quality and what happens to it long term? Is it all the other? What is it that drives people's disinclination to do it, and looking at the other way might drive an inclination?
So I think it's probably all of them, depending on who you're talking to. I think there is no one size fits all for a consumer, and I think we've touched on cost. I think we need to talk about kind of second-hand market as well, and bringing costs of the cars down for lower income households, because I think you're right, we're starting to see, at the moment, EVs are the preserve of the wealthy who have a driveway. Sort of the income of people buying EVs is between £50,000 and £75,000 a year, and 80% of EV drivers have a driveway. We are starting to hit that barrier where actually you need to bring these costs down, you need to make them affordable for lower income households, and you need to help people without driveways. And I think, depending on where you are in that spread, you're either going to be worried about, yes, if you don't have a driveway, how am I going to charge? What are my options? How am I going to charge affordably? Is that big question as well? So public charging is about 10 times more than private charging at the moment. That is a big barrier. The industry is certainly trying to bring its cost down on that. To be fair to the CPOs, they are trying to bring residential charging costs down. Government has a role to play on VAT and on energy costs and wholesale electricity, and are they thinking about charging when they're thinking about electricity reform? So there's a lot that still needs to happen to make this easier for consumers when you start to get those slightly harder to reach sectors, which are those households and those without driveways.
Yeah. If I could just pick up on that, there's some really interesting data in the used EV space, because the used EVs out there at the moment, especially if they're 2 to 5 years of age, turn quicker than any other segment on our platform. 9 in 10 people buying, or looking, I should say, at a brand new EV are also looking at those 2 to 5 year old vehicles. They might be looking at some younger ones as well, they generally are. Those vehicles have been realigned in price because they start off, like I mentioned, 22 percentage points higher than their ICE equivalents. After a year, they quickly come down, like any car does when it's coming into the used car market, but they come down to the same point that the ICE vehicles have started at. In other words, they've fallen further. From 2 years onwards, in terms of depreciation curve, they now follow a very similar pattern to their ICE equivalents. But at that point, you're now looking at a vehicle which is considerably more affordable than when you're comparing it to the brand new car. Now, clearly, a used car and a new car are always very different. When it's got had such a fall, to get to a point of price parity that it now turns really well, they're good news. They're, like I said, the fastest turning segment on our site, that sort of middle-age EV bracket. But that just shows the kind of trade-off that consumers are doing real world between new and used. It does show relative positivity that the used car market can absorb the sort of upcoming surge of supply that will keep hitting it, but so far it is doing just that, so it's quite we're relatively optimistic.
I want to throw it open to questions in a second, so if people have got questions, think them through, but yeah, you were going to add something, Damien.
Yeah, what Ian was talking about is the normalization of the price. So in the past, the electric vehicles were too expensive and not enough of them. Now that's starting to normalize, so more of them coming to the market, but the price starting to align a little better. We've changed our tone and how we try to sell electric vehicles as well. So Volkswagen, for example, talk about same spirit, different energy. And there's a whole lot of taglines that go along with it. Everything you expect from a Volkswagen with a handy plug, for example. So nice little taglines that mean you're getting exactly what you expect from a Volkswagen or a Skoda or a Cupra or an Audi, but you get that with a emissions-free drivetrain. So normalizing the process and taking away any it's different, it's not something I want to try, any of the anxieties attached with making a significant change.
They're just great cars, they just happen to be electric. It's kind of a thing that needs to happen more and more. It is beginning to happen.
Which is beginning to happen because those traditional barriers, like a very low range, if you look at the first EVs that were out there at a low range, and they were very much the preserve of the early adopters or the people that had quirky choices in what they wanted to do. People who are now traveling distances and want to get places are familiar and comfortable with the products, and they're happy to move. So long as we make the price comparable, as Ian mentioned, also Golf ID3 from the Volkswagen range, price parity almost in terms of cost of ownership. So it's getting there.
Yeah, the quirky choice thing is interesting, isn't it? Because it was a quirky choice, and now it isn't. But it's a matter of getting that message through to people that
What gains momentum is if your friend or your neighbour or your family member has an electric car and they were not a quirky chooser, then it starts to normalise and people start to get more confidence about taking them up. And that's
social proof factor of the snowball effect. You know, seeing is believing, and you see them in the street. The green number plate idea, for example, I was first to think when it first came out, was a bit weird. Is it really going to change anything? I don't know about you, but I noticed a lot of green number plates in the street, and if you drive around in certain parts of, in London in particular, you're going to see an awful lot of them, and it does reinforce your belief that it's really happening.
But there's one piece missing in that, because it's all right for us as manufacturers to talk about it. Of course, we're going to sell our products and we're going to tell you all the benefits of our products, but there's a space there, and another request that we made to government was for an unbiased information campaign from government with the support of the SMMT perhaps, that will share all of those benefits and all of those normalization factors for electric vehicles. I think that would be most helpful.
But a kind of public information campaign of the...
If they want to pursue the kind of ambitious figures in the ZEV mandate, that requires a public information campaign. That
Nobody believes anything that they're told anymore, though, by any kind of expert or government. Wouldn't that be the difficulty?
And actually, I think other organisations are filling that gap. So we as a consumer organisation try to do what we can as a small charity. There are other organisations like Electric Vehicles UK that are out there in the media really trying to plug it. I think, but I think your key point is people trust friends and family at the moment more than they trust anyone else. And you're right, the green licence plates and that sort of word of mouth is important.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions that I can see already. One at the top there, and the microphone's going across, and then we've got one down in the corner here.
Yeah, hi, Addy Superfield from Halfords. One of the ways that we can help consumers to move into EV is to enable the independent and aftermarket to continue to maintain them. You know, it's obviously a method of which consumers have been using for many, many years, is getting the cars maintained outside of OEM dealer networks. So how can we get the aftermarket and the OEMs to work better together to enable the UK consumer to make that change faster?
Ian?
I could give a view on that more from the sales point of view. Maybe Damien would touch on the after-sales point of view. But what is good to see is that there are now a growing cohort of independent retailers selling electric vehicles, which means that they are finding a way to recondition them as used vehicles. So we've seen strong growth in the last year by 25% or so. I think there are around 2,500 independent retailers of the about 10,000 we have on our platform selling EVs. Given the age of vehicles that are out there, independent retailers, would typically be selling older vehicles, so there aren't that many electric vehicles in their sort of segments. They're regaining confidence after the period of winter 22, 23, when prices fell. A lot of retailers lost a lot of money when they realigned sort of very, very quickly by 22% or so. So that is good to see. There is growing confidence, and we found in some events we've done that when an independent is able to actually get behind the wheel of an electric car, they usually say, never driven one before. And we too often in the industry are blasé because we've driven lots of them, and they're all great. And we tend to think everybody knows they're great. And they all come away from those events thinking, crikey, why wouldn't I want to sell these things? It's part of the future. But anyway, from a retailing point of view, it's definitely going in the right direction.
And from other points of view? Anyone else want to take up that?
Well, I'm very pleased that Halfords has an appetite for EV repair and servicing work as well. We've got a very extensive network across the Volkswagen Group that's very eager also to service and maintain those cars, and it's one of the deciding factors for our customers when they come to buy our cars, be they ICE or EV, that they have a very substantial and very professional dealer network across the Volkswagen Group UK brands. So if they have any further needs, I'm sure they'll look towards Halfords, but we're very confident that we have the right dealer network out there to look after our EVs as well as our ICE cars.
Okay, lady down here, and then we're going to move on.
Thank you. Lisa O'Carroll from The Guardian. Would you agree with those who think that it is China that has actually created more impetus in the EV market retail-wise? And would you welcome a Chinese manufacturer setting up in the UK? As we heard this morning, a Motor, we're looking at that. Thank you.
Yeah, we did hear something like a firm commitment, didn't we? Well, firmish. Those two questions.
Yeah, I mean, the growth initially was very much around Chinese brands and some BEVs. Chinese brands have quite a large share of the BEV market, but actually it's European manufacturers that have been really fighting back recently with a lot of product. But I think everybody's moving into that space, so there's a lot of growth naturally, as Ian was saying, with a lot of models coming in. I think in terms of would we welcome a Chinese brand coming to the UK, I think definitely. I think, the UK tends to be very much an open and competitive free market, and so, why not? And whether or not there's additional benefits you can get from having a Chinese brand here and additional learnings.
Mm.
Well, from a Volkswagen Group perspective, and I don't want to just make it a commercial for Volkswagen Group for the entire panel, but we're the leaders in selling battery electric vehicles in the market. We've got 4 vehicles in the top 10. There are far less Chinese. They're coming, of course, there's no doubt about that, but I don't think it's primarily the Chinese that are driving the transition. There are Volkswagen Group and many other products as well that are moving towards it. So whilst we have a lot of respect for our Chinese competitors that are coming into the market, we fully expect to defend our market share, and I'm sure the other OEMs expect to defend their market share also. But healthy competition has never been a bad thing.
Is it healthy competition, though? Because, I was interviewing someone the other day about this subject. I can't even remember who it was, but it was about, it's too early in the morning for me to remember these things, but it was specifically the point being made. I think it was about the question of putting further pressure on the government to do all the things that we've all been talking about all day that they need to do to encourage industry. And someone texted me, a politician texted me to say, it's not about this at all, it's about the Chinese. And his view was all the existing manufacturers are basically being undercut by the Chinese in a way that was unsustainable long term. And I think his point probably was that we needed to put up some sort of barriers to their vehicles coming here. I mean, is that really the situation, that people dare not speak about, or is it not?
I reckon it might be difficult for some of these questions for these folks.
Yeah.
So as a
So
consumer voice as well, I think the consumer voice is that we want the best product. We want the best choice, and it looks like there are lots of good products coming from the likes of Motor JQ. You heard from Victor earlier on; they're already at 2% market share in the space of no time. Their rate of growth is like 5 times quicker than Tesla. That last time I checked was super fast in this market. BYD similar at 2% market share. The people that are looking at their cars right now are translating their initial curiosity that we saw sort of maybe a year ago, people looking at an ad on Auto Trader, an ad view, a stock item of one of their cars, but not knowing much about it, so curious but not going further. They're now translating that into a lead and a sale in a way that shows they like what they're seeing. And I think from a stimulus point of view, that's generally going to drive the market. It's my point earlier around the competition factor being probably a good one. You listen to the CEOs of all the big groups, like those on the table here, on the stage here, beg your pardon, they generally are always saying the same thing about welcoming that as a challenge. And they're able equally in China to fight for their share in a market that's even more competitive with prices much lower than we're seeing over here, which is also seeing a much higher level of uptake of BEV. So I think it's to be welcomed fundamentally.
Yeah, and from the SMMT's point of view, are we expecting the Chinese factories to come? I mean, is that in our future, do you think? Our short-term?
Well, I mean, certainly what we heard earlier was that they are. I think, we're looking to make the UK a much more competitive place to produce vehicles. The industrial strategy is really helping move the dial a little bit in that direction. Clearly more could be done, but, it's definitely a step in the right direction. And I think as they, as Victor was saying earlier as well, the manufacturers are increasingly looking to be where the market is. And so naturally that would take them to sort of moving factories out of China and into European marketplaces.
Righty-ho, we've got to leave it there. We're out of time. Huge round of applause, please, for our panel. Thank you.